Okay, so we're joining you with LaRouche PAC's weekly Saturday night class series. Tonight is the third of a multi-part class by Bruce Director and myself. My name's Tony Papert on economics. And the subject of this evening's class, to be given by Bruce, is basically what is economic progress and how do you measure it? I just begin by noting that after the protracted election of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, and as a result of that, the negotiations process in that election, which I think was very productive for the country, as President Trump just noted, we're going to be having a whole new set of rules for the Congress, which will be rolled out on Monday for vote. And I can't tell you exactly everything that's in them by any means, but everything I know about these new rules is that the intention is to allow congressmen to actually represent their constituents for the first time in about 15 years, instead of being merely rubber stamps for a process carried out by the so-called leadership behind closed doors, where congressmen vote automatically for bills about which they know nothing or almost nothing, or at maximum, large parts of the bills they haven't even read by the time they vote. So congressmen will be freed up to a much greater extent in this 118th Congress to represent their constituents. And this is the opportunity for constituents like those who are joining us tonight to step forward and begin to instruct their congressmen in economics and what we need to begin reviving the United States economy, making the United States an industrial superpower, as President Trump has promised. So with that, let me pass the baton to Bruce Director.
Okay, thanks, Tony. As Tony mentioned, I think there's going to be a lot on the agenda coming up, not just in the Congress, but generally in the world. And this is building up because of a fundamental conflict in economics, really. And when I say economics, I speak of economics in the sense that Lyndon LaRouche spoke of economics, which was not what is taught in academic courses or what most people think about economics, which is wages, prices, interest rates, money, that kind of thing. But economics, which really is the subject of mankind's improving itself. And that's what we mean by economic progress. So, and the clash that's occurring is between a policy which some people call globalization, or by other popular names, which is really not a correct, it's not really an accurate description of what we're talking about, but LaRouche identified it more appropriately as the Imperial System, and specifically in the modern period from 1760s onward as the British Imperial System. And LaRouche also emphasized that the British Empire does not just include, is not, first of all, the United Kingdom, and that's its temporary headquarters, but the actual oligarchy which makes up this imperial system that in modern times is known as the British Empire is an international elite which owes no allegiance to any nation or people, but merely to a system. And I think we've had this described in previous classes. Tony Papert, in the first presentation of this series went through it in great detail, but is sort of an approach to a system which is based on a certain concept of man that goes all the way back to ancient times, which, as LaRouche summed it up many times, is what's the difference between a man and an animal? The imperial system treats human beings as a type of animal which needs a animal tender, i.e. the oligarchical elite, to control them. And that system throughout history, as Tony elaborated in his class, and I think Bob Ingram also treated this quite adequately, is failed. It's always failed. And it fails because it's fundamentally in conflict with the actual natural characteristics of the universe itself. And that's what I want to speak about tonight, how that works. And the struggle that mankind has been engaged in for our entire existence, which goes back much further than we currently are able to document. It gets more fragmentary the further back you go in time. But nevertheless, it's clear, both from our own experience and from what we know about history, that mankind's progress over these millennia is directly a function of the ability of mankind, and in general, and specifically creative individuals, to grasp the actual characteristic of the universe. Now, that's what we call economic progress. And I would argue, and I think LaRouche also emphasized this, that the American constitutional republic plays a very unique role in this respect, because it's the first society constituted to organize itself not in conflict with the characteristic of the universe, but in harmony with the characteristic of economic progress. Now, and therefore, when you look at the current political crisis in the United States, you really have to look at it from this standpoint. You have to keep this principle in mind. It's very easy, and in some cases, very entertaining to watch the political back and forth and analyze it or think about it or react to it on the basis of this or that political fight, or what people say, what people pretend to say, what's said about what people say behind their back, all the kinds of things that are in all the media. And I'm not just talking about the mainstream media. I'm talking about also, the so-called alternative media and conservative media that most people on this call spend a lot of time listening to, in which you pick up tidbits here and tidbits there of analysis here and analysis there about what's going on behind the scenes. And I admit that's very entertaining, but it is not really, it's not really what's happening. What's happening, more importantly, is the unfolding of this conflict between the imperial system and what the American system represents as a universal characteristic of mankind. Now, the best way to understand this, as LaRouche repeatedly emphasized, is from the standpoint of classical drama. Tony has a very nice article up on the website, which I would hope everybody reads and sends around and distributes, about which describes this principle, principle of classical drama, by viewing the current events and the attempt to understand the dynamic behind these current events from the standpoint of the Greek tragedian Euripides and his play Debauchee. Tony can speak about this later if it comes up, but and if he has something to add, but I really recommend that to understand generally what I'm talking about, that you go back and read this article after our discussion tonight. But these events that are unfolding politically, like any great classical drama, as opposed to a Hollywood drama, are governed by a principle, which is what's compelling the characters and the actors and the action in the drama, even though it's not explicitly stated. Now, I say the distinction with a Hollywood drama because in a Hollywood drama, the action is all there is. There's no underlying principle. It is what it is. You see, it is what you see. What you see is what you get. But in a classical drama, that's not the case. All the characters are flawed. All the characters are complicated. They're ironic. Nothing is set in, nothing happens according to some type of set idea. But what unfolds is the action and the people speeches are vehicles of an underlying principle. And that's how you have to look at these recent events, in my view, that have been unfolding in world politics, not just domestic politics, but the domestic politics reflects also something that's happening in world politics. And we could speak about this, and we can in the question period, and I'm not going to go through all that because it would be a bit of a digression to the subject that I want to get across. But that is what's actually playing out right now in all world politics, is this conflict between, in real terms, between the British imperial system and the American idea. And that's what US politics is reflecting right now. So you have to see that, even though the actors on the stage, that is the politicians and people who are supposedly the ones who are making the decisions about what direction we're going to go, may not have any idea of it. What's really compelling this is this conflict that's occurring as the globalist system, the British imperial system failures become life-threatening and evident, and the attempt to reverse that. Now we have an opportunity as a result of what LaRouche has done over the last 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, from the early 60s to 70s, and especially what has unfolded in American politics since 2015, when Trump threw his hat in the ring to become president and actually succeeded in the 2016 election, and the conflict that went on during his presidency and now in the Congress, and hopefully for a second Trump administration to come into office after the 2024 election. That this issue, again, you have to look at it from the standpoint of classical drama, is a playing out of this crisis. That what's compelling this whole MAGA movement, or whatever you want to call it, and again, I say, as LaRouche did, that this is an international phenomenon, is the effort to reverse completely the direction of the world economy and completely defeat, at least temporarily, if not permanently, the imperial system altogether. And to do that, our efforts in that regard will be strengthened if we actually understand what we're fighting for. And that is economic progress. Now, if you ask people what economic progress means, you'll get a whole bunch of nonsensical answers. People will say, well, better standard of living, higher wages, better healthcare, longer longevity. Although some people might say economic progress is reducing the world's population, saving the planet from climate change, saving the planet from the influence of human beings, reducing the world population according to the principles of Malthusianism, that is to keep always the population at a low level so that it doesn't mankind doesn't continue to use economic resources or natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. So the term economic progress really has to be defined. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, you can't define economic progress in terms of what people think of economics, wages, prices, interest rates, and so forth. But I would suggest, as LaRouche did, that you have to define economic progress as a physical principle. Now, what I mean by physical principle are exactly that, principles which govern the behavior and the organization of the physical universe itself, life, and human relations, human activity. Simple idea, simple reference point for a physical principle is Kepler's understanding of the principle of gravitation. I define this as distinct from Newton's idea of gravitation, that gravity is somehow an attractive force between any two objects in the universe, which have a tendency to attract each other according to the inverse square law. That's what you're taught in school. That's what Newton said. But Kepler, who was the great astronomer who actually discovered the principle of gravitation, understood it to be a principle of harmonic organization of the physical universe that is beyond the ability to perceive, to grasp it merely through sense perception. Simply put, we see the motions of the planets through the sky, but we don't actually see the motions of the planets to the sky. We see the motion of the heavenly bodies as it appears to us standing on Earth, as if those motions are reflected by as movements on a great sphere of which the observer is at the center. And every observer considers themselves to be at the center, no matter what their actual physical location is. However, those motions and their behavior of these motions, as Kepler understood, are not determined by the physical manifestation, that is what you see, but determined by something that is completely beyond the domain of sense perception, and that it was what he called the principle of gravitation. Now, I've written extensively about this, and other people can look at it. I'm not going to go into, we can discuss it more in the Q&A. So, but I raised that just as an example of what I mean by a physical principle. Another example of a physical principle is the principle of life. This is more difficult to understand because we know when something's alive, and then we have things which are sort of on the borderline between life and non-life, like viruses, but we don't really know what life is. It has certain characteristics which we can describe, as the great biologists and geochemists like Louis Pasteur, also Leonardo da Vinci, or V.I. Vernadsky, and we can define certain characteristics of life that are different than non-life. Things that enable us to say this process is a living process as opposed to a non-living process. And we can also define certain interactions between living processes and non-living processes. The interaction of life with so-called inorganic matter. And I mean, this is what the biosphere is about, right? Life changes the biosphere. Life turns rocks into soil, changes the atmosphere, as in the Cambrian Revolution, with the development of organisms which utilized oxygen, or the opposite, and made an oxygen-based atmosphere. So this is another type of principle, the principle of life. You can't necessarily say exactly what it is. There were attempts of this to do that in the 19th century, for example, with the vitalist movement, which tried to describe life as some essence, some type of fluid or force, life force, which existed. But that really doesn't explain it. It's not a separate force, it's an actual principle of the universe which organizes matter and itself in a different way than non-life, and the two interact in a certain way. So that's a principle. That's a physical principle. Then there's another underlying physical principle. Well, I'll just mention a third, which is the principle of human cognition versus the behavior we see in lower forms of life. Human cognition can do something that no other species can do, as LaRouche emphasized over and over again, and this really is the essence of economics, because the human mind can actually understand these principles and understand their functioning. And even though, as we're talking about tonight, that things like gravity, the principle of life, the principle of electromagnetism, all these principles are not visible and not perceivable directly by our senses, we can form concepts by which man can gain control and mastery over these principles. I mean, just think about electricity and electromagnetism. It's existed in the universe for all time, and yet it only became under man's control in the last 200 or 300 years, including the work by our founder, Benjamin Franklin. But we now can understand this principle of electromagnetism and utilize it for the transformation of both life and non-living processes. And then there's another element to this, which is very important for understanding economic progress, and that is the ability of man to understand the principle of his own mind. Now, this is really the most fun to look at. It's also very difficult. But we can do this basically not through modern psychology or something like that, but through the principle of great art. The great artists, the dramatists, the poets, the musicians, the painters. And I'll just parenthetically say, I thought it was quite interesting that in McCarthy's acceptance speech last night, he actually utilized this principle. His suggestion of his discussion of the effect on the individual of him of standing in the statuary hall, which was the old House chamber, where Lincoln stood, and looking at the clock, which was the same clock that Lincoln looked at. Now, that's a principle a poetic principle of man trying to understand his relationship to history. That's not something you can see. Or his discussion of the painting, Washington's Crossing the Delaware, in which the artist takes an actual event and presents it in a way which is different than the actual event, as he pointed out, but actually presents in more reality what that actual event actually represents by that depiction. So this is a process, another type of principle, which exists only in man, which is the principle of being able to reflect on our own thinking and how we create ideas and create new ideas, new discoveries of principle. So if you think about these principles I've described, there's a certain difference between them. And I would say that this difference really characterizes a principle which is really the sort of the principle of principles. And that's the idea of anti-entropy, which is really the essence of economic progress. Now, when you look at non-living processes, you get you can create certain there are certain instances in which you have a tendency to go from higher states of organization to lower states of organization. For example, heat processes, heat-powered machines, in which the machine is powered by creating a heat source, which then expands, pushes the machine, the piston, for example, and the heat flows from the hot to the cold, does work, but ultimately can only continue to do work if the heat source is renewed from outside the machine. That's pretty obvious, right? Biden is proving that to everybody by raising the price of gasoline so high that you realize that your machine, your car can't run unless you can get more gas. And that's a process known as entropy. It's very easy to understand, except when you put it in academic terms, and then it becomes a whole big amount of hocus pocus and confusion among people who are trying to study physicists. But that's a characteristic, a certain limited characteristic of non-living processes. Now there's something that when you look at living processes is much different, because a living organism does not run down. It actually takes simple, for example, it takes simple molecules from outside and conducts transformations on those simple molecules and makes long proteins and enzymes and so forth, and organizes itself into a system which actually perpetuates itself, which goes to higher states of organization existence. And life generally goes that way. It goes from simpler forms of life to more complex forms of life, leading up to human life. That kind of process is characterized by or is an example of the idea of an anti-entropic process, a process which goes from lower states of organization to higher states of organization, lower forms of energy flux density to higher forms of energy flux density. And this is very interesting because the kinds of things, just like you take the application of electromagnetism, whereas it has a certain behavior in non-living processes, like in an electric motor or in a computer chip, electromagnetism in a living process is completely different, and it's not fully understood. But living organisms can actually utilize and organize the distribution and transformation of electromagnetic processes in a way that does not occur outside of a living process anywhere in the universe. So one is an entropic process, and the other is an anti-entropic process. And then, of course, you have the most important characteristic of an anti-entropic process, of anti-entropy, which is human progress, human economic progress, in which man becomes an efficient agent of organizing the life and non-life into new states of organization which don't exist except for the application of discoveries of principle by the human mind. And we could, spend all night and many weeks coming up with examples of this. But I think you get the point. Now, so this is how we have to define what economic progress is. It has to be defined, in my view, and I think, which is the basis of LaRouche's economics, from the standpoint of the increase in the increase in anti-entropy. Now, if you were paying attention to what I was saying and able to grasp it, you could see that anti-entropy and entropy are not just reversals of one another. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make. You get the famous physicist, Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote a book, What is Life? And he tried to describe living processes from the standpoint of a physicist. And he makes it really, he's boxed into a corner where he develops the idea about how life is an anti-entropic characteristic, but that it only is able to be anti-entropic because of an increase in entropy out in the universe itself. That is, as living organisms consume energy from the environment, that therefore that increases the entropy of the surrounding environment, and the decrease in entropy or the anti-entropy of a living process is only possible because of the increase in entropy of the universe as a whole. And that's very much, you see that philosophy that dominates both liberal and conservative economic thinking, that the only way you can have economic progress or anti-entropy in the economy is by increasing the entropy of the universe of the around it. And you see this in the most extreme form in this whole business around climate change, that any progress that man makes by consuming resources and reorganizing the physical economy and life actually does not make progress in the economy, but makes the economy makes less progress because it creates more pollution, it increases climate change, it threatens species, and whatever the environmentalists will argue for, right? Whereas an actual understanding of what economic progress is that the economy, the man's activity to increase man's power in and over nature and man's power over himself, over mankind itself, by improved development of the human mind, that this actual process does not increase the entropy of the earth or the universe around it, but actually is reflecting an increase in the organization of the universe itself. Now, that's a very difficult concept to understand. And the reason why it's difficult is because you can't understand it without a paradox, without irony. This is why you need classical art to understand it. Because it raises all these paradoxes. Like, for example, the paradox of determinism versus indeterminism, which many of you are probably familiar with because you either studied or read popular accounts of quantum mechanics and quantum physics. You have all these paradoxes, experimental paradoxes, like the wave-particle duality or Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and so forth, which raise the question, is the universe deterministic in the sense of, say, planetary motion? That is, if you know the positions of the planets and you know the principles of planetary motion, then you know where the planets are going to be at any time in the future and where they've been at any time in the past. Versus the idea of an indeterminate world in which the experimental evidence led Heisenberg to say that you can't know fundamentally when you get down to the micro level, to the quantum level. You can't, it's impossible, not just, it's physically impossible to determine the characteristics of action of it at that domain. It's a little complicated, but I'm sure people are familiar, at least in a popular sense, with this idea of determinism versus indeterminism. So is the universe deterministic? That is everything predetermined by the mathematical application of physical laws? Or is it fundamentally just random at the macro level and things just happen? And so therefore the whole development of evolution of life from lower forms to higher forms, the development of mankind is just a random occurrence. It just happened to happen. And there's no reason why it could happen, and there's no reason why it happened the way it did, and so on. Right? Another example of this kind of paradox is the paradox that's associated with the organization of society. You see, and I've mentioned this before, you see it in Plato's, Socrates' Plato's Republic. How do you organize your society? The dialogue of the Republic clearly establishes that human society depends on the creative powers of the human mind, that man cannot be organized in a slave imperial society where everything is governed by rules and hierarchies of oligarchs, but has to be based on the creative powers. But how do you organize a society based on fostering the creative powers of the mind when creativity requires the voluntary application of an individual's creative powers? And this, of course, we see discussed. We look to the great artists to really understand that. And I think the American Republic really gets to the closest idea yet of how you have to organize that society. A society that's based on the freedom, but and the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and we can discuss this more in detail, but it really is the, but nevertheless, you can't compel this. There's no set of rules, there's no set of systems, and we've just been through the last period, which proves that. All the attempts to regulate society through rules and regulations and through dictates and intelligence agency operations against, trying to control what people read, what they think, and so forth, have all failed. It's led to a social disaster, it's led to an economic disaster, and it's led to a political disaster. So an effort like that, you have to have a freedom. But how do you guarantee that with that freedom, people will actually do good? People actually discover the utilize their creative powers and apply that on a higher level. So when you start to think about how you organize society and economic progress, then you immediately are confronted with all these kinds of paradoxes, and every effort to try and resolve them with a system or a series of definitions or some type of logical approach or a law or a new regulation, you end up in a dead end. So this gets us back to the opportunity that we have right now with this new Congress. The question is, can we use this opportunity to compel or to persuade the constituents in this new Congress to understand that what they must develop is the utilization of the organization of our society and our government for the purpose of fostering anti-entropic economic progress. That means we got to understand it. And that's the purpose of this discussion tonight. So I've set the table, maybe been a little bit too vague, but at least I got the ideas out that are worth discussing. Maybe
Yes, I think you certainly did. I thought that was beautiful.
Tony and I can, with you, flesh this out more so we can come to an understanding of this.
I mean, how in the terms in which you discussed it, I mean, how has it happened that, you know, we've experienced such periods of economic growth in the 20th century, in the pre-World War II period, to some extent the post-World War II period, and we find ourselves now in a zero growth society. I mean, you want to say something about how that's come about?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting point, because and there I think it's really come about by a shift in the thinking that occurred, as LaRouche has identified, in several turning points. And this is what I think, you know, your article on Euripides is very important, you know, also illustrates it. Let's start with, you know, the point that LaRouche particularly had focused on, which is the change in thinking at the end of World War II, and what how his generation saw the transformation they went through. You had a big, and you're talking about, you know, when I mean his generation, you're talking about the World War II generation and the previous generation, because the previous generation, the World War II generation, developed their concepts from the previous generation. So if you think about that, we're talking about the latter part of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. There was a dramatic change in economics and human progress really from the middle of the 18th century up to the beginning of the 20th century. You see this, the development of heat-powered machines, the development of electricity, and all the manufacturing, the new forms of manufacturing and so forth, which led to a huge increase in the standard of living and the economic progress, the ability to produce food, the ability to manage disease, you know, some things which are obvious to us today, but were not obvious at the time, like, you know, just sanitation. How did the living standards in most European cities change with the simple development of sanitation systems, for example, right? And this was really came in conflict. It's again, like we have today, a real conflict with the oligarchical system, right? And that led to ultimately erupted into the disasters in the 20th century, World War I, World War II, etc. And we can talk, there's books, history books and stuff that have written that analyze that, how that conflict worked. But at the end of that period, you had another revolution in human understanding of the physical universe, in terms of the discoveries of Planck and Einstein and so forth, because the continued development of the concepts of the mastery of these physical principles produced paradoxes which we still haven't solved today, like the ones I mentioned, some, for example, not the only ones, but just for example. So we've been living through a period in the last 120 years in which we've made tremendous progress in the application of these physical principles without fully understanding them, which is perfectly fine. And in many of that, of course, was driven by a pressure that was, partially driven, I should say, by, the political conflict. I'm particularly speaking about military, the application or the development of increasingly advanced technologies as being primarily motivated by the necessity for the development of military weapons and military technology, as opposed to just for economic progress itself. But nevertheless, that new developments in technology were applied to the economy, and we've had tremendous economic progress. So you think about that World War II generation, which initially experienced sort of the tail end at that time of this economic progress, which had been developing since the middle of the 17th century, 18th century, all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century. And then you had this social crisis. And the social crisis was characterized by the depressions, the economic collapses, the wars, World War I in particular, but other wars, etc. And this was also reflected in a tremendous pessimism that swept the world in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And then you had a shift. That pessimism, of course, was reflected in a real sense of demoralization and the rise of fascism, basically throughout the world, except for one place, the United States. Every other country, including Britain, flirted with, either became fascist or was virtually fascist. And the United States had a different change, largely because of Roosevelt. But there was a lot of pessimism tended to dominate during the third decade of the 20th century. But what was demonstrated by what Roosevelt did, and then especially in the war mobilization, the fight to defeat fascism, shifted that into a concept of optimism, especially among that World War II generation who at that time were in their young adulthood. And LaRouche, I'm speaking not obviously from personal experience, I'm speaking from LaRouche's unique observations of the psychology of the country in that generation from his own experience. And then after the war was over and you had a political shift, Lynn emphasized that everybody around him all of a sudden became pessimistic and small-minded. Stop to think about how we're going to have continued economic progress and apply the developments, the technological developments which have arisen, and instead become little. Part of that was induced externally by the FBI, like today, the Truman period, the McCarthy period, and so forth. And part of it was just internal capitulation. I'm tired of this fight for economic progress, and we have to then just care about ourselves. Now, it doesn't occur in such stark terms, because in any individual, people are complicated. So in every individual, you might have countervailing tendencies, but the overall characteristic of the culture shifted into this small-mindedness, which then is reflected in the baby boomer generation and the susceptibility of the baby boomer generation to accept these kinds of insane ideas that we now see in the extreme, as you described in your article. But even back then, they were pretty extreme. The environmentalism, the sexual revolution, all these kinds of things. Countervailing to that, of course, was the optimism that was fostered by the space program and the application of the economic application of these technologies, which came about off of that and related efforts. So, that's where that's an example of that, where you have again, you have to think in terms of paradoxes. You have to be comfortable to realize that, people are not, and human society is not entropic. It's not governed by a specific set of laws and rules and characteristics. And this idea, or this universal characteristic of anti-entropy, is always there. And so there's a tendency towards anti-entropy, even though there's efforts to suppress it. And that's what leads to the political conflicts and the social conflicts. That's what we're living through right now. And if we understand it on that level, we can intervene in a very powerful way. If you try and understand it on some other level, the one that you see not just in the mainstream media, but also in the so-called alternative media. Oh, this guy does this because he's with that, and this person has that view, and they're connected to this guy, and they get money from George Soros, or they get money from the Koch brothers, or they get money from this or that, and that's why they do it. And this is all some, Newtonian billiard balls bouncing off each other according to some principle. All that facts may be true, but that's not that's not the actual driving characteristic. It's this conflict between the oligarchical system, the imperial system, which is basically organized, enforced entropy, clashing with the actual human characteristic of anti-entropy. So, and the anti-entropy doesn't ever disappear. It only gets confused or suppressed or something like that at various times. And that's the conflict we're living in now. I mean, in a certain sense, if you look at what's been thrown at the American population, that we just know the tip of the iceberg, going back to, say, the suppression, the Kennedy assassination, and now we're finding out about the Kennedy files which are coming out, or the assassinations of King and Robert Kennedy, or the destruction of the family, and all these things that have happened. You'd have to ask yourself, how did mankind, why are we even here still? But we're here because that's the characteristic of the universe, is towards anti-entropy. But here again, you have to think in terms of a paradox, because it's not automatic. It requires passion. It requires a commitment to develop mankind. And that passion is so characteristic of human beings that they will fight for it, even if they don't know why.
That's beautifully said. I mean, maybe we could see what some of
Sure.
our audience is thinking.
Let's open it up to questions.